Hello Whitby students, and welcome to this, which is the final of the video lectures in the series looking at analysis of The Handmaid's Tale. We will go on to look at exam technique and essay technique in later videos, but this one is the last one looking at perhaps a linguistic concept in the Handmaids. And this linguistic concept is really important. It's modality. Now, you may know from your previous learning that there is such a thing as a modal verb, and you may be aware of some of the functions of modal verbs from GCSE or from earlier A-level study, but hopefully there's some new information here, or some really specific information that examining the way that modality functions in the Handmaids. So first off, let's ask, well, what is modality? Modality in language expresses attitudes. And one key division in modality that can be really useful for A-level students is to understand that the kinds of attitude it expresses can be divided into whether or not something will be the case, or whether something should or should not be the case. And these two kinds of modality are called epistemic and deontic modality. Epistemic modality expresses attitudes about fact and possibility, chance, whether something will or will not be the case. But deontic modality expresses attitudes using social norms and ideas such as duty, morality, obligation. So one has perhaps a strictly kind of factual approach, that's epistemic, and the other, deontic, has a sort of a moral side to it. And this is a really important distinction for us. So how is this modality expressed? Actually, there are different ways of expressing modality, and either epistemic or deontic modality can be expressed in more ways than through modal verbs. But the main way of identifying modality is through modal verbs. And modal verbs are a strictly defined category of helping verbs that help to use verb phrases. So this is quite an exclusive club. It's either a modal or it's not a modal. And the modal verbs in English are listed there. They are can, may, must, shall, will, could, might, should, and would. Now, some of them are more often epistemic and some of them are more often deontic. However, as you see from the example there, whether they're epistemic or deontic can really only be interpreted by thinking about the context of the way of their usage. So here's two examples using must. It must be raining. Well, that's epistemic because it's expressing this factual attitude, this certainty. It has no moral attitude. But if you turn around to someone and say you must not say that, you're not expressing an attitude about chance. You're expressing an attitude about what should and should not be said, and therefore you are expressing deontic modality, because what you are saying has an attitude about obligation and duty. So we can only interpret how a modal verb is being used, whether it's being used epistemically or deontically, by looking at the actual context of its use. We can also categorize modality in terms of its strength. Within both the two main divisions of modals, the epistemic and the deontic, there are variations in terms of how strong the modality is. So let's have a look at the epistemic modality there. It can rain, or it might or may rain. These are quite weak in their expression, in that it can rain just expresses the possibility and doesn't really give any indication of chance. It might or may rain gives a sort of a weak probability. It could rain is perhaps more definite about the possibility. It should rain is now being quite strong about possibility. It's expressing some kind of likelihood. It must rain or it will rain express certainty. So, as you can see, the use of different modals there has increased the strength of the attitude expressed. And the same is true for deontic modality, in that you can say you can say that or you may say that, and express that someone has permission, has, I guess, the moral right to make a statement. You could say that someone should say that, which makes it a desirable thing or even an obligation, or you must say that, which is a strong example of deontic modality, in which you're saying that there's a necessity or a very strong obligation. So it's very useful to think about when you identify modal language, is it deontic or epistemic, but also is it weak or strong in the attitude it expresses. So let's have a think about how this might apply to the Handmaid's Tale. Well, in Handmaids there are these patterns of modality that are helping to construct and present Offred's perspective. So epistemic modality is often, we find in the text, used to present Offred's uncertainty about the world surrounding her, as well as her psychological exploration of imagined or hypothetical scenarios. And as Offred experiences a lot of uncertainty about the world that surrounds her, we find there's a lot of epistemic modality. And sometimes where there's an intense pattern of epistemic modality, it's a way of presenting her uncertainty within the narrative. Deontic modality is possibly less frequent in the text. Offred doesn't always present very strong in her own opinions or her own attitudes. Tends not to perhaps express really strong moral positions on things, but there's certainly a lot of weak deontic modality in the way that she expresses her thoughts towards herself. We find that if she's describing or talking about what the attitudes of Gilead are, there she may use deontic modality, because Gilead obviously is a society in which there are very strict obligations and very strict duties about what handmaids should and shouldn't do, and about what people must do. So there's patterns of deontic modality, certainly in the religious references and the religious language in the novel, and it would be very interesting if you had time, or if anyone had time, to look at patterns of modality within the speech of, say, Aunt Lydia. Offred's internal narrative, though, it does use deontic modality, where she talks about her duties and obligations to herself. If you've ever said, "Oh, damn, I knew I should have done this or done that," or "I knew I shouldn't have," well, then you're actually expressing an attitude towards your own behaviour using deontic modality. And Offred, I guess, evaluates her own moral conduct, her own duties, using this kind of deontic modality in her internal narrative. As mentioned as well, modality is not always a question of Offred expressing an attitude towards herself, but sometimes that modality is used in character voice and in the representation of speech, and it's interesting to look at patterns in modality in the speech of different characters, related perhaps to their status and also to the way that they interact with other characters in the novel. Okay, on the following side, or on the flowing side as the PowerPoint says, on the following side you're going to look closely at these examples of modal language, and for each one the task is A, to identify the kind of modality being used, whether epistemic or deontic, whether strong or weak, but also you might be able to give a description of the kind of modality in terms of permission, obligation, possibility, those words which help us explain the actual function of a particular modal. And secondly, can you evaluate how the modality is functioning to present ideas in the narrative? This will test your knowledge of the text slightly, because these are only short quotations, so you'll have to bring to your knowledge of the context of the quotation into play to interpret perhaps how modality is presenting a character or an idea in the quote. Okay, so here we are. We have 6 examples there. Pause the video. You're looking to interpret the kind of modality used, but also the effect of it. Okay, just to talk you through there some of the options. In A, you may recall that in A, Offred is encountering Nick. I think Nick has touched her foot in the commander's household, and this weak epistemic modality presents perhaps her fantasies about him, her imagination of the possibility of how he might smell if she were to get close enough. It's quite an intimate possibility that she discusses here. For B, we see that Offred is exploring her relationship with her own daughter and using strong epistemic modality to present, I suppose, her certainty about what's happened. And that certainty, I suppose, is her exploring things that are beyond her knowledge and understanding. And this happens to Offred quite frequently, where she perhaps explores and expresses with certainty events that she doesn't necessarily know for sure. And that modality, that use of they must have, actually functions to remind us that she is expressing certainty about things that she doesn't actually know for sure. With C, we see an example of weak epistemic modality showing her indecision or her inability to interpret the commander's behaviour. And the repetition of that modal feature, it could mean, is a way of perhaps reinforcing her confused state of mind. For D, we get this strong moral deontic modality, the religious injunction, and that modal shall occurs in the biblical passages because it has a slightly archaic, outdated feel. We tend to use will in modern speech, so it's helping to construct here a kind of biblical register. Now, when Offred uses this kind of register, she really is incorporating into her narrative this kind of biblical voice, usually either interpreting passages from the Bible or interpreting parts of Aunt Lydia's speech, because shall establishes quite a high register, and Offred is perhaps her natural voice is this is not the register of her natural voice, if you like. Finally, the last couple there, E, you see another repeated deontic modal there, where she is perhaps discussing her own response to a situation. I should have stolen a knife, I should have paid attention. She's telling herself off. And so she's expressing an attitude towards her own behaviour based on her expectation or duty of herself. This is actually a section from the very final chapter where she really is exploring a panic, and she is kind of morally attacking herself in a panic because she believes she's about to die. Finally, then, there's an example of how character voice it uses modality to help convey ideas, and we have an example of Aunt Lydia's voice. You should always try to imagine what they must be feeling. Of course they will resent you, it's only natural. Here Aunt Lydia uses both kinds of modal. The should, of course, is expressing a fairly strong deontic modal to the handmaids in terms of Aunt Lydia's status, telling them how they should and shouldn't behave. But also Aunt Lydia has this kind of this total confidence. Of course they will resent you, it's only natural, and that strong epistemic modality there represents the certainty and perhaps the authority in her individual character voice. So that task there should have given you a kind of an overall taster of how modality can be used in different ways to express different ideas in the narrative of the Handmaids. Here's a longer extract, and one that is certainly worth looking at in detail. And once more, I'd like you to read this extended extract. This extract, which incidentally is about the size of an exam part to whole extract, if you were to analyse this, how would you be able to analyse the use of modality in presenting Offred's perspective in this extract? I'd like you to seek out any particular patterns. I'd like you to correctly identify them as epistemic or deontic, or as strong or weak, and I'd like you to offer an interpretation of them. Pause the video, check the extract, and add to your notes your own response. Okay, so on reflection, this is a section here where Offred is explaining a lot of her uncertainty about the commander's behaviour and her inability to understand what he's doing. She also expresses a lot of sort of moral uncertainty about what she should or shouldn't do. So firstly, the epistemic modality in this text is presenting the way that her imagination explores the possibilities of what's happening to her, sees her searching the future, I guess, or attempting to understand what the commander is thinking or doing. She's trying to interpret his way of thinking. So he might be testing me, for example. And that, I think, has the effect of foregrounding this emotional and social distance between the two characters. Offred can't interpret the commander's behaviour because it doesn't fall within the boundaries of what's expected within Gilead. And the reader, as well as Offred, is left in this heightened state of awareness, in trying to work out exactly what it is that he's doing. So I guess we could relate this use of modality to schema for our existing schema for dating behaviour. Okay, well, in a normal society, yes, I don't know, you might invite a girl back to your room to play Scrabble with, I suppose. That seems reasonable. But in a Gileadian, in our schema for Gileadian society, that really doesn't fit. So the commander's own response, of course, is also revealing. He uses epistemic modality in this rhetorical question in a way that perhaps Offred and maybe the reader wasn't expecting. Who else could I show it to? To show that perhaps he has his own set of possibilities and insecurities, and actually that response, the modal there, helps to present him as quite isolated and insecure. There's also, in the text, deontic modality, which is used as a way of representing Offred's internal moral dialogue. And that works in two ways. She has her own individual conscience, Offred as a person, as someone whose sense of right and wrong, I guess, belongs to a time before Gilead, but also she has this competing voice of the Gilead social conscience, which is often represented through this representation of Aunt Lydia. Aunt Lydia almost functions in the text as a kind of the voice of the Gilead's conscience on Offred. So in the narrative, the deontic mode is used to present this Gileadian morality. I should have felt evil. By Aunt Lydia's lights, I was evil. So there's a strong deontic modal there, presenting the fact that she knows she should feel guilt for having behaved in this way with the commander. But then Offred rejects this Gilead's morality, or appears to in her narrative, for her own intuition and self-interest. She asks, should I go further? She has a question here about her own, what's best for her to do, and this internal reasoning, I suppose, shows us that she is carefully choosing her own position within this very difficult and unprecedented situation. So these competing moral effects, or these competing moral worlds on Offred, her duty towards herself, but also her duty to be a good citizen of Gilead, as Aunt Lydia would expect, these are presented through deontic modality. And they present her as an independent moral agent, someone who has to evaluate competing influences of her social duty and her own individual and personal desire and morality. This is a feature of her narrative in which we are perhaps presented with her moral integrity. Yes, she is forced to follow the rules of Gilead and follow their moral code, but we know, because we witness her decision making within her narrative, that actually she has her own individual moral instincts that are not those of Gilead. She knows what's right and wrong for her, internalized deep within her thoughts. And I suppose we can make the final point that her thoughts are not slaved. She is not a brainwashed victim of the Gileadian conscience. She might look that way from the outside, but she retains her moral integrity. So that went quite deep, but hopefully it's useful for you to think about how modal language is used to express attitudes, and most obviously and most apparently through the use of modal verbs. We've discussed as well categorizing modality into epistemic and deontic modality. And we've looked at this idea that we can also consider the strength of modality from weak to strong modals. We've explored the way that Offred's narration uses epistemic modality, where she explores unknown situations or unknown possibilities. And we've also discussed the way that deontic modality can be used to present a kind of internal moral conflict. We have also discussed with Aunt Lydia and with the possibility of looking at other characters and the way that modality can be used distinctively in presenting their character voice. Thank you for your focus and concentration on these lessons. I hope that you're keeping your notes up to date and that you're fully taking part in all of the tasks. Don't be passive. I know there's a lot of talking on these videos, but do pause them and make sure that you complete the tasks at the right time. Thanks once again for your focus. We're going to move on next week to look at exam responses and provide you with a model answer, which is something that in feedback a lot of students said they felt they would really benefit from. So I do have a Handmaid's model answer and a key question for us to pick apart, and then we'll be free to actually start trying to put some of our ideas in practice and do our essay practice. Hooray! I hope you're all well. Thanks once again for your focus, and until next time, bye.